Alright, so it's certainly been a while, but we are back with more Conlanging. As of this recording, I finished and uploaded Alien Biospheres Part 10 just a few days ago, and that was a big one. It's funny, every single time I sit down to write an Alien Biospheres episode, I think to myself, oh, well, this one should be relatively quick and easy because I don't actually have too much to say on this topic. And then before I know it, I've written 7,000 words and I'm making the longest video that I've ever made. So yeah, that was a big one, and it kind of took a lot out of me. So I'm hoping to take things a little bit easy this month. There'll still be a linguistics video up, and probably a couple of these case study videos as well. But in general, I'm just hoping to have some time to go at a little bit more of a relaxed pace. But for right now, I would like to take a moment to say thank you to all of the patrons once again. And now, we can finally get to the part that we've all been looking forward to. So as you may remember, in the last episode, we finally finished sorting out all of these auxiliary verbs, which are essential for absolutely every sentence. Every single sentence requires one of these forms in order to mark the person and number of the subject and to convey tense, aspect, mood information. Now, right off the bat, while this is still on my mind, calling these different forms the imperfective and the perfective of the locative and non-locative copula, I guess you could call it, that's not really necessary to do in the modern lang because these forms' ancestry will be completely forgotten by this point. They'll just be the four different forms that the auxiliary occurs in. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and label these as forms 1 through 4. And apparently I'm going to use Roman numerals to do it because that makes it look cooler and more linguistic-y. And while I'm at it, I should probably change the name of these cases because these are what the cases were and roughly what they did in the proto-lang, but they've changed a lot since then. So what was the genitive is now basically the accusative, because it marks direct objects. And then the accusative, I'm not really sure what to call that, because down here I've basically just called it a postpositional case, which is more or less what it is. I think I'm going to go ahead and call it a locative, just because that's kind of similar to a generic adpositional case anyway. And then the dative is still basically the dative, so that can stay. Okay, so now that all the fiddly little details are taken care of, and we're finally happy with all of these different auxiliary forms and these potential case forms, we have finally gotten to the stage at which we can start putting simple sentences together. And in order to do that, we need to, at last, create some words. So we're going to need at least a couple of basic test words. And choosing which ones to use can sometimes be a little bit tricky, because ideally, you want to choose some words that are going to be common and simple, but the more common and simple a given word is, the more likely it is to be irregular, just because that's very often how irregularity arises. Just a word is used so often enough that older forms that are lost in other words just get used enough to resist the change, or they get used so often that they just get crunched down phonologically and end up as something different than most other words. So for a test word that we're hopefully going to use to help us establish a regular paradigm, we should pick something that's common and simple, but not too common and simple. It kind of depends on the degree of irregularity you're going for. I generally like to throw in irregularity when I can, just because it helps it to feel more naturalistic, and also because I find it just fun when word forms look completely random, but they're actually related to each other. So to start with, we should probably find a basic intransitive verb. And the verb that immediately comes to mind is to sleep. I mean, that's a pretty basic, inarguably intransitive word. It's a pretty common one, which means it could theoretically be irregular. Like in English, it's weakly irregular, like it's slept, not sleeped. But I think we can go ahead and say that it's regular in this language, at least for testing purposes. And another factor that kind of helps things here is we're looking for words that have a pretty broad semantic scope, or especially if they're not likely to have their meaning significantly change between the proto-lang and the modern lang. So something like, to sleep, to rest, that sort of word isn't really liable to change too much over the course of time. So that seems like a pretty ideal candidate to use as our first word. And now we have to think of a phonological form for it. This is actually an extremely common question that I get, is how I go about generating phonological forms, because this is apparently something that a lot of people have a lot of difficulty with. I get asked all the time about what word generators I use or what my favorite approach is, and to be honest, all I do is just come up with something that I think sounds nice, like I just come up with it off the top of my head. So the tricky thing is, we want to come up with a phonological form that we like for the modern language, but we need to bear in mind the language's history and all the sound changes. So we need to think of what we would like it to sound like in the modern language, and then figure out the protoform that would produce it. I'm kind of feeling an LH cluster. Something like ilha, I think, is quite nice. That sounds like sleep. But I realize that is also the Manchu word for flower. So probably not going with that exactly. I've got to remember that we've got all these exotic vowels to use. How about ulhi? Ulhi is nice. And that works with the vowel harmony because the I is neutral, but also when umlaut happens, umlaut fronts preceding vowels. So that would have once been e, which before the umlaut stage was a. So it would have been alhi in the proto-lang, or something similar. And that's actually important because that tells us that this spreads front harmony, not back harmony. Because remember, the vowel could also alternatively have come from the u vowel, because the u weakened to So to know whether the suffixes that get attached should follow front or back harmony, we have to know that came from e, not u. Which reminds me, we should have a column here for protoforms as well. So I would think the protoform for that would have to be al, but then that h, if it was an h in the proto-lang, then that would have just geminated the l, which is not what we want. So it would have to be one of these other stronger sounds that weakens to h later. But if it was one of these uvula or pharyngeals, then that would lower the following I. So it would have to be the voiceless velar fricative, I believe. Okay, this is me coming to you from one day later, because I loaded up our sound changes in Lexigy, and I inputted the alchi form, and I could not for the life of me figure out how alchi became ila. And I assumed something was wrong with the sound changes, so I went through and tried to figure out what could possibly be wrong. But then I finally figured out that what was happening was the initial A was becoming an E because it gets fronted by the final I into an E, and then the E, I keep forgetting this, the E turns into an E when it's in stressed position, which is what's happening here. And as for the disappearing ch, that does weaken into an H, but then word final vowel loss happens, and then epenthesis to insert a vowel between the L and the H, and then the word final H is lost, so it just ends up as ila. So there are in fact, so far as I can tell, no problems with the sound changes. That was just me being dumb. That being the case, however, that does bring up an important point, because after this velar fricative weakens to H and it becomes alhi, then the word final vowel loss happens, and we get a word final LH cluster. So we get ilch, which is really hard to say. And I don't think that that is stable enough to last very long. So we have two options. One, we can say that the cluster was never allowed word finally, and because of that, word final vowel loss wouldn't happen there. It would just remain alhi. Or the H was weak enough so that it could be lost with the final vowel. So alhi would just become al. I'm leaning towards the first one just because I quite like that cluster and I'd like to preserve it if possible. But we'll see how it works with some of the forms we're about to input. Because remember, this root is never going to appear on its own. It's always going to be in one of the converb forms. And the converb forms are derived from the three case suffixes. But they also combine with this verbal noun form. So basically the verb stem is nominalized and then placed in one of the case suffixes, which gets reanalyzed as a converb. Now I don't think I ever properly committed to this form, at least I hope not, because I remember this T was just epenthetic in case there were an illicit number of vowel mora in a row, like if we were going to attach this ura suffix onto the end of a root that already ended in a vowel. But I don't remember exactly when the epenthesis would really come into play. We could just say that verb roots can just be universally zero-derived into nouns, but that seems like a bit of a cop-out. See, I don't want the epenthetic consonant to appear too often, because if it does, that could potentially just add an extra syllable onto a whole bunch of different words where we don't want it to. But at the same time, we need a form that is distinct for the verbal noun, so that something can be recognized as having been nominalized. Actually, hold on, I just realized. Probably the most intuitive and simple way to nominalize a verb stem would probably just be to use the inanimate class marker. And I'd imagine it would always be the inanimate, because pretty much any time you nominalize a verb, that's going to be pretty definitively an inanimate concept. So if we say that the verbal noun suffix is actually the same as the inanimate class marker, that G will get lost pretty quickly. If the stem ends in a vowel, it'll just be lost entirely, and if it ends in a coda, which can only be a resonant, then it will turn into a palatal stop, which will then turn into an R later on, if I'm remembering the sound changes correctly. Which means we wouldn't even really need to use epenthesis. So if we try those forms, what do we end up with? Okay, so we end up with ölhin, ölhyr, ölhis. Now, out of curiosity, how does that compare if we just affix the case markers straight onto the verb stem? Okay, that gives us ilhin, ölhyr, and alhis. Wow, that is so much better. That is the exact sort of unintuitive alternation I'm looking for. I love how the initial vowel is different in all three of them, so I don't like using the straight-up inanimate marker as much. So one potential fix could just to say that the case markers only got suffixed on after G had already been lost, because in that case the verb stem would still maintain the same number of syllables, and the E in the inanimate marker would just fuse with whatever vowel came before it, or just turn into a long I in the case of something that ended with an I in the protoform, just like in the case of this alhi verb. So let's see what happens then if we use alhi with a long I. Okay, that happens. Exactly the same thing that happened the first time, and the same thing that we're trying to avoid. But alternatively, if we said there was a U in there, if the verb stem was actually alhu, would that make a difference? Oh dear. I mean, it would, but not in a good way. Come on, there's got to be a way to make this work. So the only way this can work, as far as I can see, is if the original verb stem from the proto-lang ends in a short vowel. And most verb stems are going to end in a short vowel anyway. So the most the verbal noun can possibly be is to just modify or replace whatever the final vowel already is. Which is kind of lame. We could say that there used to be a verbal noun affix before the proto-lang, but whatever it was, it's just been ground down and disappeared and lost to history. Again, feels like a bit of a cop-out, but honestly, I really can't see any other way to make this work. Okay, so basically we're just saying that if the verb doesn't already end in a vowel, and it would otherwise have an illegal final consonant, it'll just end in an I. But I still kind of like that idea of the inanimate class marker becoming the new verbal nominalizer. So without wasting that idea, let's just see what that on its own does for us. It just becomes straight up ilhi. It might be nice to keep that around, because if we say the class marker was affixed on after the other forms got codified, then that could be our standard sort of nominal form of the verb. That's not a bad idea. I might hang on to that. But in the meantime, we have our 3 chosen forms. Now here's something I've been mulling over for quite a while. How do we mark stress on a vowel that has a diaresis, or diaresis, or however you're supposed to pronounce it? The only thing that I can think of, and I've seen a couple of people suggest this as well, is to use double acutes, which I really don't know how to feel about that. On the one hand, the new diacritic does give a little bit of flavor to the romanization, I guess, but it's also an unnecessary diacritic which I prefer to avoid if I can. But in this instance, I can see no other possibility, so I'm just going to stick with that for now. But that means we've now got the final 3 forms of our first ever verb, and so now we can combine them with our auxiliaries to create our first ever phrases. So let's say I wanted to say, I am sleeping. I am currently sleeping, I am in the process of sleeping, I am sleeping right now, in the present tense. Well, we look at our little tense aspect matrix here, and the present tense is formed by combining form 3 of the auxiliary with the infinitive. So form 3 in the first person singular is none, and the infinitive form of the lexical verb, so I am sleeping, would be nan ilhin. Wonderful. Whereas to say I sleep, as in I sleep generally or customarily as a habitual action, the habitual still uses form 3, so that would still be none, but it uses the imperfective form of the lexical verb, which in this case will be alhur. So I customarily sleep will be nan alhur. But what if I wanted to say you slept, not me? It's now a second person singular subject, and it's a past tense action, specifically the perfect. So if we look at the perfect, it still requires form 3, but now, since we're dealing with a second person singular subject, we'll look on the chart down here, and form 3 for the second person singular is sun. And then the perfect combines form 3 with the perfective form of the lexical verb, which in this case is alhis. So you slept will be san alhis. So I think you get the picture by that point. That is the general system for how we form our tenses and aspects. But there is one other verb form that we need up here for our, I'm just going to go ahead and call them principal parts. There is one other principal part we need to concern ourselves with, and that is the imperative. Because the imperative construction is the only one that doesn't use one of the converb forms. Now last time I was debating whether or not to use the incorporated pronouns as prefixes or suffixes, and I said I was leaning towards suffixes, which a lot of people in the comments pointed out is actually what happens in Icelandic, which I didn't know. That's quite interesting. But actually, the more I think about it, the more I like the idea that they're actually prefixes. For a couple of reasons. Number one, all the converbs are suffixes, so throwing in a prefix will just give us a little bit of variety. And also, I like the idea that the imperatives are the only verbs that retain the original person marking strategy that's only, other than the imperatives, only been preserved in these auxiliaries. So back in the day, every verb would have had person marking prefixes to mark for the subject, but these auxiliaries and the imperatives are the only ones left. And in order to keep that consistent, then the person marking on the imperative would have to be a prefix. And plus, doing these sound changes actually reminds me that if they're prefixes, then that opens up the possibility of all sorts of fun phonological stuff happening at the end of the stem, which would otherwise be hidden or prevented by the converb suffix. And I think I said last time that I thought these were a bit too clunky to use as prefixes, because I couldn't really think of ways to reduce them. I think it's perfectly acceptable to say that B gets skipped over. I can see that shortening up, that shouldn't be a problem. So if we try that in Lexigy straight up, I'm putting a word final long vowel here because if I don't, then Lexigy is just going to employ the epenthesis thing even though we don't want it to in this particular instance. Because we said we're going to keep that LH cluster in there and not have word final vowel loss happen. Because if we do that, we end up with Savalhi, which even on its own is pretty good, but that kind of begs the question of where the stress is. Because if we wanted to, we could play a little loose with the stress here. It depends. If you're commanding someone to sleep, I can see the stress being placed on the root itself, like subalhi, like you sleep, just to really emphasize that the verb is the important thing. Or we could play it more standard and say that it's the pronoun that receives the stress. Now if we say that B gets skipped over, either entirely or it just gradually gets whittled down into a fricative and then an approximate and then nothingness, which syllable gets the stress will probably determine what vowel that ends up being. Because if it's subalhi, then that will become sulhi. Whereas if it's stressed on the alhi, then sualhi would just become salhi, I think. And once we take vowel harmony into consideration, what that basically means is, do we want this imperative prefix to have an underspecified high vowel or low vowel? I think I like the idea of the vowel in the person marker taking over the first vowel of the root. I know that would only really happen in vowel initial roots in the Proto-Lang. Oh, and actually, depending on when that B gets skipped over, which I imagine will be fairly early on, the final E will trigger umlaut, which will front it to sulhi. I like that, and that's even less transparently related to the other forms. I'm going to go with it, sulhi. That's our fourth principal part, and therefore our singular imperative form will be su, with this underspecified high vowel. You know, looking at this now actually, I've apparently said that there are separate perfective and imperfective forms of the imperative. I don't remember if I had any specific plans for that, but looking at it now, I don't really like that idea too much. I think what I was thinking is that the imperative preserves the original conjugation/reduplication system from the old language that has been lost in all other verbs. I kind of liked the idea of that fossilizing in just the imperatives. But thinking about it now, I think that's going to be a lot more trouble than it's worth. Because it means we're going to have to figure out the reduplication pattern for every single verb, which will only ever come up in this one very specific instance. So I think I'm happy to just ditch that idea and say that imperatives are not, in fact, marked for aspect. So if we run with that idea, then the second person plural is qassa, and that will merge nicely with alhi, because it's got an initial A, and I can't immediately think of any other way that would be reduced, and it would become qaralhi. That's pretty good. So unless I'm missing something, which is entirely possible, the plural imperative would just be qa with an underspecified low vowel, followed by either an S or an R, depending on whether the sequence that came next to it was voiceless or not. Might as well mark that one up here too. These lexical verbs have so few basic forms, might as well put them all up here. Of course, there are plenty of other forms that we need to make for this verb, but we'll get to those as we come to them. In the meantime, I think we're ready to move on to a transitive verb. So once again, there's the issue of selecting the right degree of simplicity/commonness. I think to love would be pretty fair to use. So what's a good word for to love? I think maybe something like muur. That sounds quite nice as to love, I think. And for that, in the Proto-Lang, I think the form would have to be muri, right? Or we could do something like musi, because that's going to roticize anyway. So if we did go with musi and applied our different endings, we'd get mussin, murur, and musu. Those are okay. Well, let's just see how it is using just a normal R from the beginning. Murin, murur, and murras. That's also not bad. I like the vowel alternation in the stem. I think I'm going to have to go with just the regular R, because even though I do like the geminate S alternating with the trill, I just think I prefer the vowel alternations. So let's go with those three as our basic forms. And then for the imperatives, for the plural imperative we have to consider the stress, because if we do it just straight up as one word, then the stress will fall on the antepenult, which would be qasamuri, which I don't think would make much sense. I think the A would probably have dropped out before that point, because the stress would either have been on the qas or the mu, the initial syllable of either of the words. So that would give us samur and qarmur. Not too bad. I realize I should put these in the Proto-Lang as well. I just realized that if we're going to be testing out a transitive verb, we need an object. And that made me realize that at some point, we're going to need object pronouns. Oh man. See, this is a big reason why I'm such a big fan of polypersonal agreement, because I really don't like having stray pronouns cluttering up the sentence. I like it when they can all just be incorporated straight into the verb complex and be done with it. But now that means we're going to have to take each of these forms and combine each of them with the three different case endings. I'm too lazy to do that right now, so what I think I'm going to do instead, I want to test out at least one transitive verb before we finish up. So instead of using an independent pronoun, let's create our first noun. We should probably also have a separate column for class as well. So what do we want this noun to mean? It doesn't hugely matter, it could be pretty much anything. It's probably best to keep it more general, but sometimes I like to make the test nouns relate more specifically to the con culture in some way, just to make things a little bit more interesting. Let's go with an animate noun, and I'm tempted to make it just mean animal, but I think that's a bit too general. How about something that means something along the lines of cattle, or maybe like ox, because there would definitely be some ox around where this con culture is living. I can't remember if I've said this yet, but this culture is living in an area that's kind of broadly similar to Northern Europe, a sort of subalpine tundra-ish kind of environment. So what's a good word for ox? I'm thinking something along the lines of Nurje, or something like that. And in order to produce that, we can't just do Norio, because that I and the O will merge into an so we just get Nure. But I'd like to have that RY cluster. I think the only way to do it would be to have it be Nuria, because that A would get turned into due to the vowel harmony later anyway. Okay, that didn't work. Oh, I see, it's treating the RY cluster as a as a thing that needs to be broken up with a parenthesis. Okay, that's not right. But that's fine, that's fine. If we pretended that was a long A, we get norio, but not norio. I'd like to get the fronted if possible. Oh, and of course the animate nouns will take the ro suffix when the noun class system properly consolidates. But that doesn't work either, because it's got the stress in the wrong place, because adding that suffix shifts the stress over. But that's fine, we can deal with that. One way or another, that ro suffix is actually just going to get lost anyway. The consonant will disappear and the oo will merge with whatever came before it. So the question is how to implement the fronting. We have a palatal nasal. Will that help things? No, it won't. And I don't really understand why. Unless I'm missing something, which again is quite likely. The palatal nasal should front the following O, which should then spread the front harmony to the second O. Is it applying the harmony regressively? I don't get it. I don't know why it's not fronting. I will have to look into that off air. For now, I'm just going to stick with using the palatal nasal and going with norio. And if there's something wrong with the sound changes, then I'll fix that up, and that should hopefully become norio. Or if there legitimately is something going on that makes that impossible, then I'm happy to just stick with norio. That's also fine. But of course, that is just the nominative form, because now we have to apply the case marking as well. So we might have to finesse this a bit in a second, but if we just tack on the class ending and then the case ending, what does that do for us? And now here, in this top one, the vowel is unrounding. Why is it doing that? Oh, it's because ya is the stressed syllable, so it's spreading the unroundedness. Not exactly what I was going for. Oh, goodness, and we've got a triple O. That's no good. That'll get shortened up. Am I right in thinking that if that vowel was an O instead of an A, then we wouldn't get the y? Oh. No, I'm not. Wow, something's happened. I wonder why that I is sticking around. Okay then, if we say that the case markers only got suffixed after the animate ending had reduced to a single vowel, after that voiced uvula stop was lost. Yeah, I don't really know why that's happening. Surely, as the H disappears, the O and I should become I. But I guess that's being changed by the harmony over here, even though there shouldn't be, because that's a palatal. I don't know what's going on. But other than the lack of fronting, that looks pretty decent. I think it's safe to get rid of this bit by now. So in the nominative, it would just be norio, or nerio if I can actually get the fronting to work. In the accusative, which used to be the genitive, it would just be norios. In the locative, it would just take a final N, and then in the dative, it would just take this long ending. We won't do the dual for now, because I still need to figure out exactly how I want that to work. And by the way, speaking of the dual, I think we said ages ago that the inanimate wouldn't have the dual. That would be reserved for animate and human nouns. So let's get rid of that. And then let's just do the plural forms for this one quickly. These are the same things, except they take the tihi instead of ru as a suffix. Now I'm pretty sure if I do it straight up, it's going to go wrong. Whoa, what the hell is that? Oh, I see, very nice. The epenthesis and the metathesis jumped the T all the way to the back. But I don't think that will work with our current system, because I think that would interfere with inverse number stuff. But I think we're saying that early on the T gets skipped over. Ah, there we go, we finally got some fronting going on. And applying the case ending gives us those. And the only one of those that I don't like, and isn't what I expected it to be, is that one. I don't know why. Oh, it's because epenthesis happens before the S and the R can meld into a geminate. Okay. But that wouldn't happen anyway, because SR would never be permissible as a word final cluster, so we can ignore that. It would be a geminate R in there, like we would expect. So I think those would be our forms for the plural. And with those done, we can construct our first transitive sentence. So if you wanted to say something like, he or she loves the ox. Yeah, usually test sentences will be kind of contrived and not make very much sense. But if for whatever reason you did want to say that, that is in the habitual. So we need the form 3 of the human singular, which is van. Then it's V2 word order, so it would be subject, auxiliary, object, verb. So next word would be the ox in the accusative, which is norios. And then finally the lexical verb would be in the imperfective. And thus, to say he or she loves the ox, you would say van norios murur. I am happy with that for now. I'm sure I'm going to spot loads of mistakes as I edit this, and I still need to check up on those sound changes and make sure that they're inputted properly. But on that note, I'm going to leave it there for today. And before the next episode, I might just go ahead and make the table of independent pronouns, just because I don't think you would get much out of watching me just apply all the sound changes and just append all of the different pronouns with all of the different case endings and make just a big table of them. That would just be kind of tedious to watch, I imagine. So next time then, we will probably just continue in the same vein of making some new words and trying out some new forms and expanding our grammar. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.